Welcome to the Friends of the Earth Ireland System Change webinar series. It aims to facilitate learners to connect the dots between global justice issues, draw out the root causes of injustice and reflect on action pathways, while also amplifying the work being done by groups locally and around the world. Today, we're looking at climate justice in relation to racial justice and the need for an intersectional movement, and that's with Miriam Duo today. Miriam is a climate and racial justice activist based in Brussels, a campaigner at Friends of the Earth Europe, and climate advisor for Equinox, working for racial justice. Miriam works on exposing the ways big fossil fuel companies sabotage climate justice efforts and on making the links between colonial capitalism and climate justice. So I'll now pass over to Miriam for a presentation to tell us more. Thanks very much for joining us, Miriam.
Yes, hi everyone. It's really nice to be here. And I'll just dive right in. Like Evelyn said, if you have any questions, just don't hesitate to put them in the chat, and clarifications, just interrupt me if you don't understand something, want me to repeat, speak slower, etc. I'll try to accommodate. Yes, so like Evelyn said, I work at Friends of the Earth Europe, and on that I work on lobbying and fossil fuel companies and kind of how the big economic powerhouses of the world are influencing legislation and defending their interests, which are not in accordance with our interests, which is to have a livable planet. In the fossil fuel industries, obviously, has no place in that future. So that's a bit of my day job. And then I also work with Equinox Initiative for Racial Justice, and that's the first people of color-led initiative for racial justice in the kind of EU space. And we work on many different topics, from migration to law enforcement, gender justice, and climate is obviously also a big pillar of our work. And we published a number of reports. I took a lot of today's talk from our climate justice report, but there's also many more on the different topics I just mentioned that are available on the website. So maybe just to start with the basics and a few concepts, because I'm going to say words today that you might not have heard of or have heard but don't necessarily know what they mean or what I mean by them. So I mean, obviously climate justice is the pillar of today's talk, and what it means to me is that it just considers the social injustice that a warming climate creates, while at the same time the historical and social responsibility of corporations and countries who have and still benefit from polluting and exploiting ecosystems. So that's kind of what we mean when we talk about climate justice. Another word that's in the title of this presentation is intersectionality, which has become a bit of a buzzword lately. Intersectionality was a term that was coined by Black feminist scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in the US. And the goal is basically to examine, as the name indicates, the intersection of global system of domination, so racism, colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy, which all of these concepts produce classism, homophobia, transphobia, heterosexism, and racism, and how those oppressions intersect. So if you are a white woman, you suffer a certain amount of oppression because of sexism and patriarchy. If you're a Black woman, you on top of that also suffer the oppression tied to racism. And these are two different situations that need to be accounted for. And so all the various categories of identity, like gender, class, race, sexuality, disability, religion, and any other identity intersect to create a unique situation that needs to be taken into account. And that's what we mean by intersectionality. I'll also use the term racialized people or racialized communities. That's because, of course, as everybody agreed, there's no biological race. All human beings are equal. And the concept of race is a social construct. It's a political process of othering or marginalizing some groups of people. And it's a structural and systemic oppression, which we call racialization. So you're being racialized by the system, by the political systems of oppression that we live in our society. Colonialism, it's probably a term that you know much more. Basically, very quickly to define, the combination of territorial, cultural, linguistic, political, and economic invasion, and then domination of a group of people by another group. And what's important to keep in mind today in our context is that many formerly or currently colonized territories feel the impact of colonial legacy today and dynamics within international relations, systems, and social structures still to this day. So that is why it's important to look back and remember. And again, it's part of the historical responsibility of Europe and other nations in the global north in order to explain what's happening today, and that will inform then the solutions that we need to implement. So why, so in link to this, why is climate justice important? Why should we care about this specific concept? While the so-called, so like I said, the developed nation, which are countries in the global north, mainly colonizing powers, did so on the back of the global south throughout history by means of extraction, which is very relevant to climate, obviously, but it's an extraction of resources, but also labor. And, slavery is one example of it, but there are many more that, again, still happen to this day. And while not all European countries were active colonizers, not all European countries have colonized territories, many of them supported and or benefit from the colonial system. So again, that's where this historical responsibility comes in. And when it comes to climate, it's very striking to see that Europe is responsible for about 22% of total emissions since 1750. And that's not counting the emissions of the colonized countries. So for instance, the emissions of, say, Morocco, which was colonized by France and its independence was only acquired in 1956, the emissions happening in Morocco up until that date should be France's emissions and not Morocco's emissions, because it was a colonized nation. So this 22% does not even account for that. So it's in reality much more. And so there's this huge responsibility, and almost a quarter of all emissions that have happened in Europe and are the responsibility of Europe. But none of our climate and energy policy either acknowledge that nor contribute to that fair share of emission cuts that we need to do in order to have a socially and a climate just transition and system. And colonialism also resulted in the development of European nations, but also the underdevelopment of the colonized nations. And I don't really have time to get into it today, but I highly recommend you read a book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. And he goes into detail about how this sort of underdevelopment concept of colonized nations. Because the now independent countries are still under the oppression of massive multinational companies based in the global north. And it's interesting to remember that most fossil fuel companies and mining companies in Europe used to be state-owned or are still state-owned. So they are a legacy of colonialism as well. And they still extract all the possible resources, exploit workers, while at the same time committing atrocious environmental and human rights violation that results in displaced communities, loss of income and livelihood, and sometimes even death. We know that, for instance, more than 358 human and environmental rights activists have been killed in 2021 alone. And these were people defending their communities, their livelihood, their homes, really, which is nothing less than what any of us would do in that situation. And very often those deaths are linked to very powerful companies in the global north. And there are many documented cases of fossil fuel companies, mining companies, buying the power and being very much linked to people dying, trying to defend themselves against those companies. So here, Europe and the countries in the global north bear huge responsibility in the situation that we're in today. And that's why we need to contribute the most to the efforts to curb climate breakdown. Because, like I just said, and looking at from an intersectional perspective, climate breakdown just highlights and exacerbates all the systems of oppression that our capitalist system rely on. So that was a bit of a kind of global perspective. But if we look at Europe, inside of Europe, the same is basically happening. So in that same way, all the systems of oppression are highlighted and made worse because of the climate crisis. And we know in Europe that racialized communities are more impacted than others by the climate crisis that we're seeing. And that's where one concept specifically comes into place, which is environmental racism. So again, for a bit of a kind of definition, environmental racism acknowledges the reality that marginalized people around the world, intentionally or unintentionally, often face the worst effects of environmental hazards, such as air pollution, dumping of waste, than other groups of people. Studies show that racialized people have higher chance of living near industrial areas, major roads, mines, power plants, dumps, and that also means that they have a higher rate of illnesses due to air, water, and soil pollution. Racialized communities are often denied the right to a healthy and good quality life, particularly because of racist housing that segregates racialized communities in resource-poor neighborhoods, and have been neglected ever since. And also they have the least access to resources and power to challenge those injustices. So maybe just a few examples that I took from our report on environmental racism in Europe specifically. In the UK, for instance, in London, we know that Black communities are more likely to be situated near in areas of high air pollution, and that causes asthma, that causes a number of health issues that we know, and it kills hundreds of thousands of people a year because of subsequent health issues due to high air pollution. In Hungary, the National Public Health and Medical Officer Service reported that 15% of Roma communities are situated 1 kilometer away from untreated waste disposals, and 11% are situated near animal carcass deposits, which exposes them again to a number of health issues. In general, Roma and Traveler communities are also among the most affected by energy poverty, especially in winter, but also in summer, which leads to obviously, you know, being cold, but also mold, humidity, and all the health issues that go with it. In France, a study found that towns with the highest population of residents born abroad, unfortunately, there's no racial statistics in France because, you know, everyone is the same, but which is another problem, but you can't solve a problem that you ignore. So the studies often have to rely on other data, such as nationality, for instance. So those towns that have the highest proportion of residents born abroad are much more likely to be next to polluted sites than those with low proportion of persons born abroad. And in all these cases, marginalized communities carry additional burdens, financial or otherwise, due to, again, all the health conditions and overall low quality of life that subside from being near those polluted areas. So these are just a few examples of environmental racism from the report, and it only looks at the racial component of those communities, but again, taking into account an intersectional perspective, we should take into account gender identity, ability, age, class, sexual orientation, etc., to have an accurate picture of how different communities are affected by climate change, because within the racialized communities, there are also levels of privilege that also need to be taken into account. So, you know, disabled people of color are even more at risk, queer people of color as well. So it's also something, again, that needs to be really taken into account and analyzed to have a clear and, you know, accurate picture of the situation. When it comes to policy, just a very short point on policy, we know that, I mean, climate change in general, climate policy fails to acknowledge those specific harms I just talked about and specific impact on different communities. It's a very kind of blanket policy for everyone. And that means that those communities who need the most support are just ignored and don't get the support that they need. The current policy landscape promotes neoliberal solutions, perpetuates and repeats patterns of extraction and reliance on resources from the global south. There's a high, for instance, if you look at the high emphasis on electric cars and solar panels and things like that, all of these require a huge amount of mineral and natural resources, which are mainly found in the global south. So again, there's an extraction question of where are the resources that we need. And it's from when you read climate policy, there's an entitlement there, which is almost neo-colonialist, of saying, well, we will just go and get lithium from Latin America and it will be fine. But the entitlement of saying we deserve it or we should have access to it is something that we need to question as well. And the consequences on those communities that don't necessarily want to be wrecked and mined for our benefit is also something we need to think about. And just maybe on the very small example concretely of the European Green Deal that is, all the rage, it relies hugely on technology, on those kind of magical technology that is going to save us all. So they talk about carbon capture and storage, and they talk about emission trading scheme and carbon offset and even net zero, which all of those are solutions that were brought by the fossil fuel industry, and it's just greenwashed message. And they were just taken on board over the voices of frontline communities and the climate justice movement. So that's really something that, again, is just a form of green capitalism. So we're just keeping everything the same. We just put, a green stamp on it, and everybody can shift their regular car to their electric car and we'll all be fine. And that, might be the case for us in Europe, but it's not going to be the case for everybody in the world. And that's a huge injustice that needs to be considered as well. And we need, things like that are not necessarily talked about. We need strong laws that hold multinational accountable for those human and environmental rights violations that they cause. And they're not held accountable at the moment, and they get away with it in many, many ways. That is something that we truly need to counter and not, close our eyes when we see it. So yes, and we see there's a lot of examples when, climate, quote unquote, policies don't take into account social justice. We end up with a movement like the Gilets jaunes in France, which started when the French neoliberal government announced a fuel tax that would apply across the board to everyone. And again, would have been another additional burden on poor people. And that's when people rebelled, and that's when people revolted. And that's also an issue that we need to think about in terms of our movements as a climate justice movement. What are the solutions we're advocating for? Are they socially just? Because if they're not, then it's also where a lot of the bad reputation of the climate movement comes from, is advocating for solutions that are very elitist, eat organic. Not everybody can afford organic food. All of those things that are really, don't fly. If you compare the price of a train ticket and the price of plane ticket, it's completely different world. If you have a family of, a family of 4 and you're low income, the only way you can go on vacation is potentially flying. So there's really things that we need to think about. What is the problem we're trying to tackle, and who is going to pay for that? Is it the airline company, or is it the people buying the ticket? And that's really something that is also the only way we'll create a movement that is inclusive, and also a bigger movement, because we need to rally more people to our cause. But we're not going to do it if we keep, if we advocate for solutions that are not socially inclusive. And we need to be more radical in our campaigning. We need to demand system change, and we need to, I see it a lot in Brussels these days, where people are negotiating for 0.1% of emission reduction here and there, when there's no path for this reduction. It's absolutely not a socially just measure, but people are just spending hours and hours doing that and then declaring victory when they get their way, and it's not going to change much. But we really need to have more radical solutions that also put at the center the most marginalized. Because if we don't, then we're just supporting this green capitalism again, and it's not serving anybody. Another aspect of this as a movement that we need to think about is how the climate movement perpetuates white supremacy. So, you know, we all live in the same society. The climate movement doesn't operate in a vacuum. We live in a racist, classist, ableist, patriarchal world, and we're not exempt from those dynamics of oppression. So how do we make sure that we limit or at least are aware of those oppressions within our movement? The history of the climate movement comes, well, part of it from the conservation movement. And this movement was extremely colonial and white supremacist. I mean, the founders of the conservation movement were outspoken about removing indigenous population from protected land, and were really, their goal was to have pristine nature. And a lot of groups derive from these movements, and they need to reckon with their past in order to not repeat the mistakes, because otherwise a huge risk that we have in our movement is ecofascism, which is really creeping in. And it's really, for instance, if you take the example of the emergence and the kind of very prevalent overpopulation argument, this idea that, you know, there's too many people on the planet, especially in the global south, and that this is a problem, that's just delusional. I mean, we know that the world's richest 10% is responsible for over 50% of carbon emissions. It's not about the number of people, it's about the rich being obscenely rich and being able to just pollute however they want. And that's an old number from 2015, by the way, so it's probably worse now. As we've seen during COVID, the richer have been, you know, getting much, much richer, so it's just only getting worse. Another eco-fascist argument is this idea that we should act on climate action because otherwise we're going to have climate migration, and that being a danger. And that leads to some people campaigning for more military budget to protect resources. The Pentagon declared climate change a national emergency a few years ago in the US. So there is this risk that things are just going to become more militarized, which is not what we need, really. So it's crucial that we counter that as a social movement, and that we counter those arguments and call them out if we hear them, and really do not let ecofascism take over, which it comes from fear, right? It's a genuine fear, and also distraction, really. I mean, especially the overpopulation argument is a distraction, but it really is something that we need to examine in our groups and counter and answer to every time we hear it. And, you know, because the same way that countries have a responsibility to pay their fair share, I think that the climate movement has a responsibility to be in solidarity with allies in Europe and in the global south. So maybe just to conclude, I think we need to acknowledge that those who are the most affected are the least responsible for the climate crisis, and advocate solutions that redistribute power and end our extractive colonial capitalist system. We need solutions that tackle the root causes of climate change, which are colonialism, capitalism, and all the systems of oppression that they create. And it's the only way that that will win. And the only way to do that is to listen to frontline communities. I mean, we know that, for instance, indigenous people make up less than 5% of the global population, but there's 2 to 80% of global diversity. And at the same time, the fossil fuel industry spends millions every year lobbying EU institutions and government to sabotage and slow down climate action. And surely taking advice from indigenous people rather than the fossil fuel industry would be a thing that our decision makers do, but they're not. And we know that they're not acting in our interest. And looking at history, nobody ever obtained anything by asking nicely. So that is why we need a strong climate movement to be a counterpower and to make them act in our interest, because they won't do it out of the goodness of their hearts, I don't believe, at least. And that's the responsibility we have as a climate movement. The climate battle, like any other battle, is a power move. It's a matter of power. We need to build a truly intersectional movement in solidarity with the most impacted people, both in Europe and around the world, be it racialized communities, poor people, workers, indigenous people on the front line, human and environmental rights defenders. And that's the only way that we'll win. If we build this movement, if we really manage to rally people around us, then we'll be powerful enough to make them hear us. But we only do that if we are in solidarity with people first. You can't expect people to just meet you if you don't do that for them first. And climate and environmental justice, it means social justice, racial justice, gender justice, queer justice. It means being in solidarity with workers and frontline communities. And we really, for me, whenever I think about what we should do, I always try to remember that if you put the most marginalized people at the heart of policymaking and or any solutions, really, it can be also local initiatives, etc. If we just put those marginalized people at the center and make sure that we have a solution that benefit them, it will benefit everybody. And so that's really the thing I'm trying to remember myself when I, think of solution, or when I think, oh, could this thing work, etc. I really try to ask myself that question. And everything is connected. And when it comes to solidarity, there's many ways that it can be done. If you work on food, migrant workers are the ones picking up our food most of the time. Connect with migrant worker unions or groups. If you work on nature, connect with racialized communities that don't have access to nature. Air pollution, the same thing. And a lot of people, a lot of racialized communities are climate activists, but they just don't call themselves that, or they're not considered that. The leading people fighting air pollution in Europe are Black and brown communities who live in those neighborhoods, and the ones that are first impacted, but they're not necessarily taken seriously by us, the climate movement, or by authorities, and they also don't feel like they belong with us somehow. So the first effort is also to, listen to them and ask them, what do you need? How can I help? How can I support you? And that's really how we form relationships. I also believe that you'll have a presentation later today that will be much more in the Irish context, and I can't really speak to that. So hopefully you can attend that and have much more concrete local answers. But yeah, I'll just end here. I have a bit of resources that we can share, but maybe that can be sent in an email. I'll stop talking now. And if you have any questions or clarifications, just let me know. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much to Miriam, and I hope everyone has a lovely rest of their day. And for those joining later on today, I'll see you soon. Bye now.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.